We're doing a study in Matthew chapter 12, and I hope you're doing some of this on your own, but we're looking at verse 15 down through verse 21. And the thing that just captures me about this particular part that we've been looking at, and we've been slowly just working away at the beginning of it through the last few Saturday nights, but tonight we're going to begin to look at the heart of the whole passage, and we're looking kind of in an overall view of the entire passage, which is a prophecy. And he's quoting this prophecy from Isaiah, obviously, in verse 17. And as you get into the prophecy, you find out it's the longest prophecy that Matthew quotes in his book. So it becomes very, very significant. And, of course, it's a messianic prophecy, which means it's all focused on the person of Jesus. And it's giving us this phenomenal picture of who Jesus is. And frankly, the picture of who Jesus is disturbs me at my core. Because I really have a desire to be like Jesus. And I've expressed this before, and will probably keep on expressing it because it is a sincere desire that I have. I'd really like to be like Jesus. I'm not a bit interested in being like Jesus in his culture. I'm not interested in his culture. I don't want to go back. I want to keep my vehicles. I'm not interested in washing over a scrub board. I want my washing machine. So I'm not interested in cultural stuff. I don't want to go back to his culture. I'm not interested in going back to his dress. Robes don't turn me on at all. Not a bit interested in that. So it's none of that kind of stuff to be like him. But what I am interested in is to be like him inwardly. I'm not even talking about outside deeds, although that would be neat, but I don't know if I can put all that together. I don't care about walking on water. Hey, if I had the power to walk on water, I don't think I'd do that. I'd use it for something else probably. So I'm not interested in walking on water, and healing is fine. If I had the ability, I think that would be neat to heal people, and there are desperate situations that need the touch of God, and I'm for that. But I'm not even really focusing on that. I'm not focusing on doing miracles, those kind of activities that I'm not even interested in having the crowd that he had. What I'm really interested in is being like him inside. I'm talking about attitude. I'm talking about tone. Really been interested in tone. See, I can say something to you and it's exactly right and it's really true, brother. And I can walk away wiping my hands saying, well, I told him the truth, bless God. But the tone in which I said it. I want my tone to be like Jesus. See, I can't pull that off. You recognize that, do you not? That you and we cannot pull that off. We can do that sometimes, but consistently, all the time, day after day, in all circumstances, you cannot pull that off. You have no chance of being like Jesus. Inwardly, what motivates him, what drives him, his tone, his attitude, you can't pull that off. But is there a possibility that the nature of Jesus could actually fill you as the Father actually filled him? Could we find his secret? Could we know what he knew? Could we be gripped with what he was gripped with? Could we be changed inside? Would you go after that with me? Would you seek that with me? Not just to get by, not looking for a home in heaven, but really craving his personhood and embracing him in such intimacy that I would be like him. Phenomenal picture he gives us of Jesus. The interesting thing about the picture is it's in contrast, which only makes it more vivid. And we've been walking through that contrast. The contrast begins at verse 15 as you see it. But when Jesus knew it, he withdrew from there. Now, obviously, the conjunction but there sets up the contrast. And it's contrasted with verse 14, which is the Pharisees. the Pharisees went out, plotted against him, how they might destroy him. But Jesus. So you got the picture of the Pharisees over here and all that they're about. And we've been walking through that as from the beginning of chapter 12 all the way through when they showed up at chapter 12, verse 1. They've been hounding him, stalking him is the proper word. And we've got the Sabbath day scene taking place. And then you've got the verse 9, you've got the in the synagogue on the Sabbath day and the withered hand being healed, which is significant. And you got that whole scene. And then this scene, the Pharisees go off and get the tone that's going on in their life. They're plotting, counseling. They're putting their heads together and they're plotting murder. And then and they got one thing on their mind. They want to destroy him and everything that he is. They cannot stand. Jesus just irritates them to death. So that's all over here. And over on this side is Jesus, and what's he all about? And we've been walking through that. He withdrew from there, and there's a whole message in that. And then you get this picture. The multitudes followed him and healed him. That isn't going on over here, by the way. The Pharisees are in a council room plotting murder. Jesus is over here with the multitudes following him, healing them all. See, who do you want to be like here, folks? And then you come to verse 16, which is what we want to try to deal with tonight. Yet he warned them not to make him known. Now, back up and get the impact of this. When Jesus knew it, verse 15, he withdrew from there. Great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. Yet he warned them not to make him known. Now, great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. How many miracles would that be? Come on. We know at one point it was 5,000 men are following him. So, hey, we're into the thousand bracket, the thousands of bracket here. And he healed them all, which means there had to be hundreds of miracles. And can you imagine? He's telling every miracle he does, he says, now, you keep still about this. Don't tell anybody about this. Just shh. Don't you think that's intriguing? See, if I could do a miracle, I'd say, woo! Tell everybody! Go on TV! Wouldn't you? Jesus says. And if you look at this passage and you say, well, wow, that's really unusual. That's strange. Well, not for Jesus. Because, let me just walk you through Matthew. If you just turn back to chapter 8, which is not hard for you to find. It's right after the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7, Sermon on the Mount. Then you come to chapters 8 and 9, which are the chapters which are the heart of the 2-year ministry in Galilee, all summarized up. And in this summary, where he handpicked these miracles that Jesus did in the Galilean ministry, he starts out with the very first one of, obviously, in chapter 8, verse 1. And Jesus comes out of the Sermon on the Mount. He marches right down, and you'll look in verse 2 of chapter 8. There's a leper who came and worshiped him, and this man with all of his leprosy is crying out to Jesus. And in verse 3, Jesus says, well, I'm willing, be cleansed. I'm willing to heal you, be cleansed. And the guy immediately, his leprosy was cleansed, which is phenomenal. And then you know what Jesus says in verse 4? Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one. Now, this was at the beginning of his ministry, so you would have thought here he could have made an exception and said, whoo, tell everybody, my crowd will be bigger the next time. But even here at the beginning of his ministry, he said, shh, don't tell anybody. So there you get the same kind of idea. Now, if you go to chapter 9, we're still in the Galilean ministry. And again, this is a 2-year period kind of being summarized up. And if you go down to verse 30, well, what you've got is in verse 27, 2 blind men are following him, crying out, saying, Son of David, have mercy on us. And when he came into the house, the blind men came into him as also. And he said, in verse 28, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" They said, "Yes, Lord." He touched their eyes. "According to your faith, let it be to you." Their eyes were open, and Jesus sternly warned them. This is verse 30. Their eyes were open. Jesus sternly warned them, saying, "See that no one knows it." Now, this is the third time in chapter 12, folks. The third time that Jesus is doing miracles, and obviously this was a repeated thing. That he started out with this the leprosy in chapter 8. It's moved to the blind man, and obviously there were all kinds of miracles in between that he must have done this too. And here are hundreds of miracles, and it says he healed them all and warned all of them not to make him known. So this sets up a pattern that Jesus was constantly doing miracles and saying, "Shh, keep a lid on it. Don't tell anybody." So there's no way you can look at this and say, "Oh, this is really unusual." This is the normal pattern for Jesus. Now, when you look at verse 16 in chapter 12, which is what we're dealing with, he says, "Yet he warned them not to make him known." It's really a strong statement. It isn't a casual thing. There's no way you can get out of that it was just kind of a casual, easygoing, "Well, I prefer this, but hey, if you don't, it doesn't matter." It isn't that kind of deal at all. The word "warn" there is really strong. It means warned. It has the idea of rebuke. It means to admonish strongly with urgency and authority. It's almost a command that I'm commending you to keep still about this. I do not want this mouthed around. And the word "known" is really significant there in verse 16 as well. "Yet he warned them not to make him known." The word "known" there is really strong as well because it has the idea of public. In other words, I don't want this is not, "Well, don't tell your wife" kind of stuff down at the living room. This is, I don't want you to publicize this. I want you to keep a lid on this so that the community doesn't know that this is going on. Now, would you admit with me that in light of the entirety of the New Testament, a minister of Jesus, that is really strange? Because if you knelt at this altar of prayer and God radically changed your life, one of the first things we do is want you to stand up and testify and tell everybody, go home and tell your family, tell the guys down at your job, make a public testimony. We want everybody to know the miracle that God has performed in your life. And as you look at the New Testament, there is that emphasis all over the place that we should mouth this everywhere. That we want you to go out and be very, very mouthy. You have no problem being mouthy, but be very, very mouthy about Jesus. And that emphasis is in the New Testament. I mean, you come to the Great Commission, and Jesus is saying, "Go and make disciples of all the nations." I want this blabbed everywhere, all the nations, man. Everybody, everywhere, every man, under all circumstances, I want them to know about this. Before his ascension, Jesus turned, and that's the scripture you've memorized in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where you will receive power. And what is when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, you will receive power. And what's this power going to do? Oh, it's going to make you mouthy. See, you're going to run off at the mouth and be witnesses in Judea, in Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the world, man. You're going to be mouthy about this. This is not going to be something you can keep a lid on. Amen. See, the New Testament is strong on that there's this emphasis all over. But here, how do you reconcile this? How do you put this together? It seems to be so contrary to the very tone of the New Testament. Why would Jesus say that here? Now, you can go to the commentaries, and of course, they will tell you, they will give you the pattern. And there's probably some truth to it. I'm not saying there isn't. And the pattern is that Jesus is trying to keep a lid on this, they would tell you. Jesus is trying to keep a lid on this because his fame is accelerating. Multitudes are following him. The Pharisees are already out to kill him, plotting how they can destroy him. And if this accelerates any faster, his crucifixion will come too soon. His ministry won't be completed. So he's trying to slow this thing down and saying, keep a lid on it. lest this get out of hand too quick. Now, there's probably truth to that. I'm not denying that. But if you stayed with the text, look at this thing. Verse 16. Yet he warned them not to make him known. That's the next verse. Verse 17. That's purpose clause. He tells you why. He told them not to make him known. I want a lid kept on this and all the miracles, and I don't want you talking about this. And then it says this, it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, and then he gave this prophecy. So obviously the reason, biblically, in this passage, that Jesus is saying, keep a lid on it, the reason he's doing that is that the prophecy might be fulfilled. Now, you might think that Jesus knows the prophecy, he knows the Old Testament, and so he's constantly saying, keep a lid on this. Why? Well, the prophet said I was supposed to do that, so I'm doing that to fulfill the prophecy. That's not the case. That makes sense to you? See, the case is that this is the way Jesus is, and the prophet knew how Jesus was through the inspiration of God the Father. And so the prophet prophesied this because Jesus is not this way because the prophecy says he's this way. The prophecy is this way because Jesus is this way. See, you got to get that straight. So Jesus is not saying, the prophet said this, so I got to do this. No, Jesus is going to do this. That's why the prophecy is written this way. And that's what Matthew is saying. Matthew was saying, I'll tell you why Jesus did this, because that's the way Jesus is. In fact, this is backed up by prophecy. And he quotes this Isaiah thing. Now, it's interesting, from verse 18 down through verse 21, you've got the prophecy. And it's basically broken down into 4 verses. And each verse tells you something significant about Jesus. And I just want to rush through these 4 things, which will be impossible. Number 1 in verse 18 is the source idea. In other words, he's talking to you about sourcing, and he's going to contrast the Pharisees and how they are sourced with Jesus and how he's sourced in verse 18. In verse 19, there's the sound idea, this tone thing that we were talking about. You got the sound idea. And again, he's going to contrast the sounds that are coming out of Jesus contrasted with the sounds that are coming out of the Pharisees. In verse 20, you've got the scrap idea, how Jesus treats scrap compared to how the Pharisees treat scrap. And then in verse 20, you've got the scope idea, the scope of ministry concept given to you. The Pharisees, their scope compared to Jesus and his scope. Let's look at the first one, verse 18. Behold my servant whom I have chosen. This is the prophecy, a messianic psalm. Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. Now, when we get done with this overall view, we're going to go back and we're going to analyze each section. So this is not the only time you're going to be hearing this. But it's interesting in verse 18 that there is a progression going on in this. Look at this thing. Behold my servant whom I have chosen, number 1. My beloved, number 2. In whom my soul is well pleased, number 3. I will put my spirit upon him, number 4. And putting his spirit upon him is the climax of the first 3. Whoa! Jesus is filled with the Spirit. What sources Jesus is the Spirit of God. Wow, this is not new. Hey, we got that out of chapter 3 of the book of Matthew. Because Matthew starts out the whole ministry of Jesus with what? His baptism. The Father through the Spirit came and filled the man called Jesus. Wow. And everything Jesus is going to do in ministry, he's doing because he's filled with the Spirit. He's not the way he is because he's God, although he is God. But that's not the reason he is what he is. The reason he is what he is because he's a man filled with God and is sourced by the Spirit, which puts you in the realm of possibilities that you also could have the same resource he had. So maybe I could be inside what Jesus is. Why? Because what was in Jesus could now be in me. Now, if you stand up and say, oh, I'm filled with the Spirit, I'm going to immediately say to you, woo, you've been chosen. That was the first thing, you remember. And oh, you're the beloved. That's the second thing. And oh, you're well-pleasing to God. No wonder you're filled with the Spirit. Amen. That's phenomenal. I want to be like that. Would you like to please God? Would you like to have God just say, oh, he pleases me? Hey, you may not give a rip about me, but wouldn't it be something to have Jesus, God, just wrap his arms around me and say, oh, you're my beloved? I'd rather have that than you anyhow. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be something? And oh, think about being chosen. I mean, that God has chosen you. And I know, bless your heart, we say this all the time, and it must sound just like words to some people, but see, how can you get around that? And we've discussed this before. How can you get around the fact that you are absolutely unique? Man, fingerprints, DNA, everything about, look in the mirror. Everything about you is significantly different than everybody else who's ever been. I mean, of all the millions of people that have been, you'd think he'd duplicate along the way. Which tells me that there is something so significant about you, so special about you, that God has such spatial plans for you, that there is dreams that are bigger than you have any idea about. And I'm not talking about just this 70 years again. I'm talking about the next billion years, man. Don't blow the dream of God for a billion years for you. And billion, you know, it's just a figure to say eternal. This eternal plan and dream that God has for you. And I'm not talking about sitting in heaven playing a harp. I'm talking about the flow of his eternal purpose that makes you significant, that he has made you for, has created you spatial in light of everybody else, made you. Nobody else can pull this off. And how he dreams for you for this, and he aches for you, and he's chosen you for this, and he's loved you for this, and you please him in this. Do not blow that for junk. Amen. See, don't do that. Don't blow it for junk. Now, this is all contrasted with what? The Pharisees. Well, what sources the Pharisees? Well, self. So again, you've got this spirit-sourced man who's moving multitudes, who's fulfilling the dream of God, who's sourced by the Spirit of God, who literally is the beloved of God, who has all this going on in him and through him. And over here on this side, you've got Pharisees who are remember, the top elite religious people of their day, and they are, what's the deal with them? Well, they're plotting murder. They're how are we going to kill him, and how are we going to destroy, and how are we going to ruin, and they're dedicated to that issue. In the passage, their dedication is to the law. And as we've talked before, the Old Testament structure bends itself to self-sourcing. Because God is over there, I'm over here, and here's His law, and I have to pull this off. And they lived in that self-sourcing, I got to get this done. So even their best is self-sourced. Their best days are self-sourced. Their best activities are self-sourced. It all spills out of them. And of course, what that brought them to, in Jesus' words, and if you would certainly say Jesus should know, his last sermon was his last preached sermon. It's in chapter 23. You don't need to turn there. But it's a whole sermon. It parallels the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, he started with a great sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. He ends with this phenomenal sermon, and it gives the 7 woes to the Pharisees. Listen to what he says about them. All their works they do to be seen by men. Every single thing they did in their religious life, they did to be seen by men. In other words, it was all a show. It was all about, how do I look? It was all about, how do people view me? It was all about, that was their whole motivation. Aren't you tired of living in that realm? See, that's men-pleasing kind of stuff. Don't you get tired of that? Wouldn't it be something for your whole life to be focused in on and sourced by until you're in the flow of, and you're literally the beloved, the chosen? See, this is the whole picture of who Jesus is compared to men who are just constantly walking on eggshells, worrying about who's going to say what about them and how they're seen by men. In fact, it causes them, he says, to do things like they make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at the feast, the best seats in the synagogue. See, it's all show. Isn't it interesting? We fight over the head tables. We fight over recognition. We fight over who gets credit. Why do we do that? Well, it tells us who we are. And Jesus is saying, don't tell anybody. Is that the way we are? Let me give you this next one and we'll quit. But verse 19, he will not quarrel. We get a picture of Jesus. He will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. That's Jesus? Yeah. In fact, you remember the Matthew 27 scene and the whole business of the crucifixion and the trials and all that was going on. And you remember what the prophets said about him, that he would be as a sheep before his shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Let me read you what happened to him when he was before Pilate. And all of this is going on, and all the accusations are being made, and all the lies are being told, and all of this is taking place. And this is what it says about him. And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Don't you just feel like crawling in a knothole someplace? My life is so filled with griping. My life is so filled with complaining. They hear my voice on the streets. They hear my arguments. They hear my defending. They hear my, well, that's not right. This isn't fair. Jesus was so strong on this. Again, he is being compared with the Pharisees. He says in Matthew chapter 6, he says, listen, when you do charitable deeds, don't do like the Pharisees. How do they do it? Noise. Display. When they gave $100, they wave it in the air so you can, whoa. He says, don't do that. He says, man, when you pray, don't do it like the Pharisees. How do they pray? On the street corner, oh, great God of the sky, almighty, oh, sovereign one. They do all of this. Why don't you get on your face in your closet in intimacy with him? See, why is it show? Why is it, oh? He says, when you fast, what? Don't be like the Pharisees. How do they fast? Oh, they have their hair messed up, and they make their face look haggard, and they have wrinkled clothes, so everybody knows, oh, you're fasting, aren't you? Yeah. He says, why? Don't do that. Wash your face, comb your hair. See, why is it always a parade? Why is it? See, you make noise. Your life is noisy. Your tone is loud. It's filled with argument and defense and brag. And Jesus doesn't. You see it in this chapter 12. Disciples are in the grain field in verse 1, picking grain on the Sabbath day. And one of the Pharisees, look! See, they're right there on the scene. Look! Your disciples! Jesus couldn't even go to church. Look at verse 9. When he departed from there, he went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man with a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful that they might accuse him? See, it's all, do you get the whole tone of what they're about? Compared to Jesus. See, when you come into the room, do things smooth out and calm down? Or do things heat up? See, what kind of spirit do you generate? We're always upset down at my house. Well, why? Why are you always upset? Maybe because you live there. Under terrible conviction, Jesus, I want to be like you. But God, my tone, my noise level, my voice is heard on the street. My quarreling is known everywhere. Could I be sourced with what you're sourced with? Oh, Jesus, could you live in me? Could you live in me? Could you live in me? Could I be like you? Please. Could you do in me tonight whatever needs to take place? I'm not talking about activities. I'm talking about inside stuff. Could you radically change who I am? Could I go from the self-sourced, noisy, yelling, high-pitched, arguing, gotta have, show off, mouthy, could I go from that kind of a person to one that is sourced by the Spirit of God, bringing peace and love and could I be changed from the critical, the negative to the positive? Instead of being a destroyer and ruining everything, could I be a peacemaker, bringing things together in wholeness? Instead of dividing, could I unite? You alone could do this in me. You alone could do this in me. And whatever you got to do in me to bring me into this, to make me like you, oh, I want to be like you. Oh, I want to be like you. In the name of Jesus, I want to be like you. Please, please, I want to be like you. I want your tone. I want your flavor. I want your aroma. I want your fragrance. I want you. Oh, let's seek together. Altars open. Not for show, not for display, for humility. For posturing ourselves in His presence. I want to be like Him.